In ancient Rome, when Senator Marcus Aurelius Calvus fell to a gladiator's sword in the Colosseum, the crowd roared with bloodthirsty approval. But when his widow, the noble Livia Calvus, appeared at the gladiator barracks 3 days later to purchase the very slave who had killed her husband, Rome fell silent with shock. The gladiator's name was Gaius. A former legionnaire turned slave, he had survived 43 battles in the arena through skill, cunning, and an iron will to live. What he hadn't expected was to face the one person in Rome who knew the truth about her husband's death. Livia's marriage proposal sent shockwaves through the Senate, the patrician class, and every gossip in the forum. A senator's widow wedding her husband's killer was not just scandalous, it was unthinkable. But what secret could drive a grieving widow to such desperate measures? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Villa Calvus as Livia examined the blood-stained signet ring that had been removed from her husband's finger. The gold bore the family seal, an eagle clutching a laurel branch, now tarnished with dried blood that no amount of cleaning could remove. She turned the ring over in her palm, feeling its weight like a chain around her soul. 3 days had passed since Marcus Aurelius Calvus met his end in the Colosseum, and Rome still buzzed with speculation about why a senator had entered the arena at all. The official story spoke of honor and courage, of a nobleman proving his mettle before the people. But Livia knew better. She had always known better. Her marriage contract lay spread across the polished oak table in Marcus's former study, the parchment yellow with age but the terms still binding even in death. Arranged when she was barely 16, the union had been a political necessity. Her father's debts forgiven in exchange for his daughter's hand to a man 30 years her senior. The contract spoke of dowries and inheritance, of political alliances and social obligations, but never once mentioned love. "My lady," came the gentle voice of Claudia, her most trusted servant. The older woman entered carrying a tray of honeyed wine and fresh bread, though Livia had barely eaten since receiving word of Marcus's death. "The household staff awaits your instructions." Livia set down the ring and studied Claudia's weathered face. In her 50 years of service to the Calvus family, the woman had witnessed 3 generations of secrets, lies, and carefully maintained facades. If anyone understood the complexities of Livia's situation, it would be Claudia. "What do they expect of me?" Livia asked, gesturing toward the closed doors beyond which the villa's numerous servants continued their daily routines. "Grief, my lady. Public mourning befitting a senator's widow." "And privately?" Claudia's eyes met hers with understanding born of years spent navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics. "Privately, they wonder why you haven't wept." Indeed, Livia had shed no tears for Marcus. How could she mourn a man who had made her life a carefully orchestrated performance? For 15 years, she had played the dutiful wife, hosting dinner parties for his political allies, managing his household with quiet efficiency, and bearing his verbal cruelties with practiced grace. Marcus had never struck her. He was too calculating for such crude displays, but his words could cut deeper than any blade. She walked to the window overlooking the villa's gardens, where marble statues of long-dead emperors stood sentinel among perfectly manicured hedges. Everything about this place reflected Marcus's obsession with control and status. Even the flowers were arranged in rigid geometric patterns that prioritized order over beauty. "Claudia, what do you know of gladiators?" The older woman's eyebrows rose slightly. "My lady, the one who killed Marcus. What manner of man was he?" Claudia set down the tray and approached carefully. "His name is Gaius, my lady. Former legionnaire, they say. Served with distinction before circumstances changed his fortune." "What circumstances?" "Political troubles, I'm told. His commanding officer fell from favor, and Gaius was swept up in the aftermath. Sold into slavery to satisfy debts that weren't his own." Livia nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. Marcus had mentioned the gladiator in passing weeks before his death, referring to him as an interesting specimen, with a tone that suggested more than casual observation. Her husband never spoke casually about anything. "He fought with reluctance," Claudia continued. The crowd noticed. A gladiator who kills without joy is unusual in the arena. Yet he killed effectively. When pressed, yes, Marcus gave him little choice. The admission hung between them like incense in a temple heavy with unspoken implications. Livia turned from the window to face her servant directly. You believe Marcus orchestrated his own death? It was not a question, and Claudia did not treat it as one. I believe Senator Calvis was a man who planned everything, my lady, including his exit from this world. Livia returned to the table and picked up the marriage contract, studying the signatures and seals that had bound her to a man she never understood until it was too late. Marcus had been brilliant, calculating, and utterly without warmth. He collected information the way other men collected coins, hoarding secrets and leveraging knowledge for political advantage. But in recent months, something had changed. He had grown suspicious, paranoid even, checking locks twice and speaking in whispers with visitors who arrived after dark. Livia had assumed it was simply the natural progression of his ambitious nature, the price of climbing ever higher in Rome's treacherous political hierarchy. Now she wondered if he had discovered something that made his continued existence dangerous to others. My lady, Claudia said softly, there is something else. About the gladiator. Tell me. He asked about you. Livia's hand stilled on the parchment. Asked what? Whether you were truly grieving. Whether you had loved your husband. Claudia paused. I told him that grief takes many forms, and love is not always what it appears to be. The words struck Livia like cold water. A gladiator, a slave, had inquired about her emotional state. Why would a man who had just killed her husband concern himself with her feelings unless he knew something about Marcus that others did not? Claudia, Livia said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Prepare my traveling cloak. I have business to attend to. My lady, I'm going to visit a gladiator. The bronze military diploma felt heavier then. Its weight suggested as Gaius traced the raised letters with calloused fingers. Issued 15 years ago by the 2nd Legion Augusta, the tablet bore witness to his honorable service along Hadrian's Wall, fighting Pictish raiders in the mists of Britannia. Now it served as his only reminder of a life before iron shackles and arena sand. Still dreaming of your glory days? Brutus asked from the adjacent cell, his scarred face twisted into what might have been sympathy. The Thracian gladiator had lost his left eye to a tiger 3 years prior, but his remaining vision was sharp enough to read the melancholy in his friend's expression. Gaius carefully wrapped the diploma in oiled leather and returned it to its hiding place beneath the straw mattress. In the gladiator barracks, possessions were few and precious. A man's past could be stolen as easily as his bread ration. I dream of many things, Gaius replied, settling against the stone wall. Most of them involve being somewhere else. The Ludus Gladiator School of Quintus Maximus housed nearly 200 fighters in varying stages of training and despair. Some, like Brutus, had been born into slavery and knew no other life. Others, like the Germanic tribesmen captured in recent campaigns, raged against their chains with the fury of caged wolves. But men like Gaius, who had fallen from citizen to slave through political misfortune, carried a different kind of burden, the weight of knowing exactly what they had lost. Dr. Quintus approached their cells with his characteristic limp, a reminder of his own gladiatorial career ended by a poorly timed stumble against a seasoned retiarius. The old trainer's weathered face held the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned to read death in the subtle shift of a fighter's stance. Gaius, he called, producing an iron key. You have a visitor. Such announcements were rare. Gladiators received few guests beyond physicians treating injuries and occasional family members saying final farewells. Gaius rose slowly, his body still aching from the previous day's combat. Killing Senator Marcus Calvis had required every skill he possessed, and the memory of the man's final moments haunted him more than any of his previous 42 victories. Who comes to see a slave? Brutus asked, genuine curiosity overriding his usual cynicism. Perhaps someone who values honesty over status, Gaius replied, though he had no idea what to expect. The visitor's chamber was a stark room furnished with 2 wooden chairs and a small table. Gaius had been here twice before, once when a distant cousin begged him to confess to crimes he had not committed, and once when his former commanding officer offered empty promises of intervention that never materialized. But today's visitor transformed the shabby space simply by occupying it. Livia Calvis sat with the poise of a woman born to nobility, yet her dark eyes held depths that spoke of intelligence and pain carefully concealed. She wore a simple stola of deep blue, appropriate for mourning, but her bearing suggested strength rather than fragility. This was not the broken widow Gaius had expected. "You are surprised to see me," she observed, her voice carrying the cultured accent of educated patricians. "Senators' widows rarely visit the men who made them widows," Gaius replied carefully. In the arena, he had learned to read opponents quickly, but this woman presented no obvious threat, which made her infinitely more dangerous than any beast he had faced. "I am not like most senators' widows." She studied his face with unsettling intensity. "Nor, I suspect, are you like most gladiators." Gaius remained standing, unwilling to sit without permission. 15 years of military discipline followed by 3 years of slavery had taught him the value of observing proper hierarchy, even in circumstances that defied normal social conventions. "Your husband was a complex man," he said finally. "That is a diplomatic way of describing Marcus." Livia's smile held no warmth. "But we are not here for diplomacy, are we?" "I am not certain why we are here at all, my lady." She reached into the folds of her stola and produced a small scroll, its wax seal broken. "Because of this. You found it on my husband's body, did you not?" Gaius felt the blood drain from his face. The scroll had been hidden in Marcus's toga, discovered only when Gaius had checked for concealed weapons, a habit that had saved his life more than once in the arena. The contents had been shocking enough that he had hidden it immediately, unsure whom to trust with such dangerous information. "How did you know?" "Because Marcus told me you would find it." Not in so many words, but he was always careful to plant seeds of information where they would grow into useful trees. Livia leaned forward slightly. "He chose you specifically, Gaius. The fight was not random chance." The revelation struck him like a gladius to the chest. He wanted to die? He wanted to die on his own terms, by the hand of a man he judged worthy of the task. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. A man who would discover his final message and act upon it wisely. Gaius sank into the remaining chair, his legs suddenly unreliable. "Why?" "Because my husband uncovered a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of Roman government. Because he knew his own death was inevitable but refused to die quietly in his bed, poisoned by enemies who would claim natural causes." Livia's voice carried steel beneath its cultured tones. "And because he believed you were the only man in that arena who possessed both the skill to kill him cleanly and the honor to protect his secrets." The bronze diploma hidden in his cell seemed to burn with significance. Marcus Calvis had somehow learned of Gaius's military service, his fall from grace, and his reputation for integrity even in the degraded circumstances of slavery. "What did the scroll contain?" Livia asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "Names," Gaius replied quietly. "A list of senators planning to overthrow the emperor. Evidence of bribes, secret meetings, and planned assassinations. Including evidence that would see me executed alongside them, unless I act quickly and decisively." Gaius met her gaze directly. "You were involved in the conspiracy?" "I was married to a man who involved me without my knowledge or consent. My name appears in documents I never signed, linked to meetings I never attended." Her composure cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath her aristocratic mask. In Rome, guilt by association is often sufficient for crucifixion. The pieces began forming a picture that both terrified and amazed Gaius. Marcus Calvis had orchestrated his own death to protect his wife while exposing his co-conspirators. But such a plan required someone trustworthy to carry out the next phase. "What do you want from me?" "Maybe we should be careful, yes?" Margaret showed him Morrison's personal compass, which she had discovered during a more thorough search of the burial site the previous afternoon. The compass was unlike any military-issue equipment she had seen in museums. Someone had carefully etched additional markings around the standard directional indicators, creating what appeared to be a secondary navigation system. Most intriguingly, the modifications pointed to coordinates that, when Margaret checked them against modern maps, led to locations that didn't appear on any official World War II battle maps. "My grandfather, he mentioned something like this," Pierre said, studying the compass carefully. "He say the American tank commander, he have special equipment for finding things. Not for fighting Germans, but for finding hidden places." The rest of the expedition team noticed the tension that morning. Thomas Crawford, the young archaeology student, approached Margaret as she was packing her equipment with unusual care. "Mrs. Walsh, is everything all right? You seem rather on edge today." Margaret made a decision that would prove crucial. Instead of keeping her discoveries secret, she explained the situation to Thomas and to Dr. Helen Morrison, a retired Army nurse who had joined the expedition hoping to understand better what her late husband had experienced during the war. Both immediately grasped the implications of what Margaret had uncovered. Dr. Morrison, despite sharing a surname with the tank commander, had no family connection to Harold Morrison. But her nursing experience during the Korean War had taught her to recognize when official stories didn't match medical realities. If this crew was killed by artillery, there should have been some remains, some debris. Tank crews don't simply vanish into thin air, no matter how direct the hit. Thomas, with the enthusiasm of youth combined with academic training, began researching on his laptop using the farmhouse's wireless internet. Within an hour, he had uncovered additional troubling details. Mrs. Walsh, according to these archived reports, the search for Morrison's crew was called off by direct order from Divisional Command. That's highly unusual. Most searches continued for weeks, especially for experienced crews. The breakthrough came when Thomas found a reference to Morrison's crew in a German intelligence report that had been declassified only 5 years earlier. The document, captured after the war, mentioned an Allied special equipment transport operating in the sector where Morrison had disappeared. The German report noted unusual Allied activity involving small groups of tanks operating independently of larger formations, carrying cargo that didn't match standard armored reconnaissance profiles. That evening, as Margaret was documenting her findings in her notebook, her phone rang again. This time, the voice was different, younger, more urgent, and definitely American. "Mrs. Walsh, my name is Sarah Morrison. I'm a journalist in Washington, and I believe you found evidence related to my grandfather's death. Someone's been trying very hard to keep me from investigating this story. I think we need to talk." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah Morrison, granddaughter of Harold Morrison, great-niece of Robert Chun. The tank crew that had vanished wasn't just a historical mystery. Their families were still alive, still searching for answers, and someone was still actively working to prevent those answers from coming to light. "How did you know I found something?" Margaret asked. "Because 48 hours ago, someone broke into my apartment in D.C. and searched through all my research files. They took everything related to my grandfather's disappearance, but they missed my backup files. When I started making inquiries, a contact at the Pentagon warned me that there was new activity around this case. Mrs. Walsh, I think you and I are in more danger than either of us realized." Professor James Hartwell arrived at Pierre's farm on a drizzly Thursday morning, his rental car loaded with research materials and specialized equipment for examining historical artifacts. At 72, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades handling fragile documents and priceless relics. His reputation in academic circles was built on meticulous scholarship and an unwavering commitment to historical truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might prove to be. Margaret had prepared for his visit by organizing all her findings in chronological order, creating the kind of systematic presentation that had made her an effective teacher. The artifacts were laid out on clean white cloth in Pierre's dining room, each item photographed and documented with precise notes about location, depth, and condition when found. Professor Hartwell's examination of the evidence was thorough and methodical. He spent nearly 2 hours studying each piece through a magnifying glass, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. "Mrs. Walsh, you've uncovered something extraordinary here. These artifacts don't just suggest that Harold Morrison's crew was involved in non-standard operations. They provide clear evidence that someone has been deliberately concealing the true nature of their mission for nearly 8 decades. He pointed to the German intelligence report that described unusual Allied equipment transports. I've seen references to these operations in other declassified documents, but always in fragments, always incomplete. The pattern suggests systematic removal of information from official records. Someone with significant authority has been sanitizing the historical record. Sarah Morrison had flown to Paris and driven directly to Normandy upon learning of Professor Hartwell's involvement. Her arrival that afternoon brought a new dynamic to the investigation. As an investigative journalist for the Washington Herald, she possessed skills in research and source development that complemented the academic approach of Professor Hartwell and the methodical discovery techniques of Margaret. Sarah's physical resemblance to the photographs of her grandfather was striking. The same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. At 34, she had already established herself as a journalist who specialized in uncovering government cover-ups and historical injustices. Her investigation into her grandfather's disappearance had been a personal project that she pursued alongside her professional assignments. "I've been researching my grandfather's case for 15 years, Sarah explained as she examined the artifacts. "Every time I get close to something significant, I encounter the same pattern. Missing files, sealed records, and officials who suddenly become unavailable for comment. It's as if someone has been systematically erasing evidence for decades." Pierre had been listening quietly to their discussion, but finally spoke up with obvious reluctance. "There is something else. Something my grandfather tell me before he die, but I never understand what he mean." He disappeared into his study and returned with an old photograph, black and white and slightly blurred, showing several men in military uniforms standing beside what appeared to be a tank. "My grandfather, he take this picture in secret, the night before the American tank disappear. He say the men were nervous, arguing about something. He hear them speak of gold, of treasure that must be hidden from the Germans. But also, he hear them worry about orders from their own commanders." Professor Hartwell studied the photograph carefully. This could be Morrison and his crew. The uniforms and equipment match the time frame, and the tank appears to be a Sherman with some unusual modifications. He paused, then looked directly at Sarah. "Your grandfather and his crew weren't just carrying military equipment. They were transporting something valuable enough to kill for." The investigation took a significant turn when Professor Hartwell produced a document he had discovered in recently declassified OSS files. The Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, had maintained extensive records of covert operations during World War II. Most of these files remained classified, but some materials had been released following Freedom of Information Act requests. The document was a brief memo, heavily redacted, that referenced Operation Anvil Drop and mentioned the need for experienced tank crews capable of discretionary operations. The memo was dated June 10, 1944, 2 days before Morrison's crew disappeared. Most of the details had been blacked out, but one line remained visible. "Asset transportation requires crew elimination upon completion to maintain operational security." Margaret felt a chill reading those words. They were planning to kill Morrison and his crew from the beginning. This wasn't a mission that went wrong. It was a planned execution disguised as a military operation. Sarah's journalist instincts immediately focused on the practical implications. If this document is authentic, it means there are people still alive who know the truth about what happened. Operation Anvil Drop involved multiple levels of command authority. Someone authorized these executions, and someone has been covering up the evidence ever since. The group worked late into the evening, cross-referencing the OSS document with Pierre's grandfather's photograph and the artifacts Margaret had discovered. A disturbing picture began to emerge of a covert operation that involved transporting valuable assets, possibly Nazi gold or other looted treasure, using trusted Allied tank crews who were then eliminated to prevent them from revealing what they had seen. As they prepared to adjourn for the night, Professor Hartwell made an observation that would prove prophetic. "We're not just investigating a historical crime anymore. We're threatening a conspiracy that has been successfully maintained for nearly 8 decades. That kind of longevity requires ongoing effort and resources. Whoever is behind this cover-up is still active, still powerful, and still very much invested in keeping these secrets buried. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pierre's farm. Klaus Weber arrived unannounced, driving a well-maintained Mercedes that seemed out of place in the rural French countryside. At 87, he moved slowly but with purpose, his bearings still carrying traces of military discipline despite his advanced age. His English was excellent, spoken with the careful precision of someone who had learned it as a necessity rather than choice. "I apologize for the intrusion," Klaus said, addressing the group as they gathered in Pierre's kitchen. "I read about your investigation in the local newspaper. There are things I witnessed during the war that may be relevant to your research." He paused, studying their faces carefully. "I was a Wehrmacht tank commander in this region during June 1944. I saw things that troubled me then and have troubled me for 79 years since." Professor Hartwell immediately recognized the potential value of Klaus's testimony, but also understood the delicate nature of the situation. Wehrmacht veterans, even those willing to speak honestly about their wartime experiences, required careful handling to ensure their accounts were accurate and unbiased by decades of reflection and regret. "Herr Weber, we appreciate your willingness to share your memories," Professor Hartwell said diplomatically. "Any first-hand accounts from the German perspective would be invaluable for understanding the complete picture of what occurred." Klaus nodded and reached into his briefcase, producing a carefully preserved document written in German. "This is a copy of my unit's daily report from June 13, 1944. I kept detailed records throughout the war, against regulations, because I believed someone should document the truth of what we experienced." Sarah Morrison, whose German was functional thanks to her journalism education, began translating the document aloud. "Unusual Allied activity observed in Sector 7. Single Sherman tank operating without escort, proceeding toward coordinates outside normal operational patterns. Tank appeared to be carrying additional equipment not consistent with standard reconnaissance mission." Klaus interrupted the translation. "What your grandfather's crew was doing that night, it was not normal tank operations. I was positioned with my Panzer about 2 kilometers away, and we received orders not to engage. Not to engage Allied armor, this was highly unusual. Our standing orders were to attack any enemy vehicles on sight." Margaret felt a chill of understanding. "Someone on the German side knew about Morrison's mission and ordered your unit to let them pass." "Precisely," Klaus confirmed. "But there is more. Later that same night, we observed Allied soldiers, not Morrison's crew, but others, working in the same area where the tank had been. They were burying something, and they worked with the efficiency of men who knew exactly what they were doing." Professor Hartwell leaned forward with intense interest. "Herr Weber, this suggests coordination between elements of Allied command and German forces. That would have been treason by any measure." Klaus's expression grew darker. "Professor, what I witnessed in those final months of the war challenged everything I had believed about military honor and national loyalty. There were secret negotiations happening at levels far above my command. Some German officers were already planning for after the war, already making deals to save themselves when defeat became inevitable." Sarah had been taking detailed notes throughout Klaus's account. "Herr Weber, do you know what Morrison's crew was transporting?" Klaus hesitated, then reached into his briefcase again and produced a small metal fragment. "I found this near the location where I observed the burial activities. I have kept it all these years, not understanding its significance until I read about your discoveries." The fragment appeared to be part of a military shipping container, but it bore markings that none of them immediately recognized. Professor Hartwell examined it carefully through his magnifying glass and whistled softly. "These markings are consistent with containers used for transporting precious metals or valuable documents. This isn't standard military equipment. This is something designed for protecting high-value cargo." Klaus continued his account with obvious reluctance. "During the final weeks of the war, rumors circulated among German officers about vast quantities of gold and other valuables being secretly moved by both sides. The Nazi leadership was desperate to hide their stolen wealth before the Allies could recover it. But some Allied commanders were apparently willing to make private arrangements to share in these spoils. Margaret was beginning to understand the scope of what they had uncovered. Morrison and his crew weren't victims of German fire. They were murdered by their own side to prevent them from exposing a conspiracy between Allied and German officers to steal Nazi gold. That would explain the ongoing cover-up, Sarah added. If high-ranking Allied officers were involved in stealing Nazi treasure, their reputations, and possibly their families' reputations, would be destroyed if the truth came out. Even today, 79 years later, some of those families might still be benefiting from stolen wealth. Klaus nodded grimly. War creates opportunities for both heroism and terrible crimes. What your grandfather discovered, Miss Morrison, was evidence of one of those terrible crimes. The men who killed him weren't protecting military secrets. They were protecting stolen fortune. Professor Hartwell stood and walked to the window, looking out over the peaceful French countryside where such dark events had unfolded decades earlier. We're no longer investigating a simple wartime disappearance. We're documenting evidence of a criminal conspiracy that involved theft, murder, and an ongoing cover-up that reaches into the present day. As the afternoon progressed, Klaus shared additional details from his wartime service, painting a picture of a complex network of secret agreements and hidden agendas that operated beneath the surface of the official war effort. His testimony provided crucial corroboration for the evidence Margaret had discovered and added new dimensions to their understanding of Operation Anvil Drop. The investigation had evolved from historical curiosity to criminal inquiry, and everyone present understood that they were now dealing with forces that had successfully maintained their secrets for nearly 8 decades through methods that apparently included intimidation, theft, and possibly worse. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following week as Professor Hartwell and Sarah Morrison utilized their respective networks to gather additional evidence. Sarah's contacts in investigative journalism provided access to declassified documents that wouldn't normally be available to civilian researchers, while Professor Hartwell's academic credentials opened doors at military archives across Europe and North America. Their breakthrough came when Sarah discovered a pattern in casualty reports from the weeks following D-Day. Using databases compiled by military historians, she identified 3 other tank crews that had disappeared under circumstances remarkably similar to Morrison's case. Each crew had been highly experienced, each had been assigned to unusual solo missions, and each had vanished without trace in areas where recovery of remains should have been possible. "Look at this," Sarah said, spreading documents across Pierre's dining table. Tank Commander William Hayes and his crew disappeared June 18th. Tank Commander Robert Sullivan and his crew disappeared June 25th. Tank Commander Michael O'Connor and his crew disappeared July 2nd. All elite crews, all assigned to independent reconnaissance missions, all vanished completely. Professor Hartwell studied the casualty reports with growing concern. The timing is too regular to be coincidental. These disappearances follow a pattern, roughly 1 week apart, always involving solo tank operations, always in areas that would later be described as having sustained heavy German artillery bombardment. Margaret had been quietly working on her own line of investigation, using her methodical research skills to trace the backgrounds of the missing crews. What she discovered added another disturbing dimension to the conspiracy. Each of these tank commanders had exemplary service records, but they also shared something else. They all had experience with valuable cargo transport from their time in North Africa or Italy. These weren't random selections. Someone specifically chose crews who had proven they could be trusted with high-value shipments. Klaus Weber, who had remained at the farm to provide additional assistance, confirmed that German intelligence had noted unusual Allied tank activity throughout the period in question. "We received instructions to avoid engagement with solo Allied tanks in specific sectors during those weeks. At the time, we assumed it was related to Allied reconnaissance efforts, but the pattern you describe suggests something far more systematic." Sarah's journalism background proved invaluable as she began connecting the missing tank crews to a broader network of suspicious activity. Her research revealed that several high-ranking Allied officers who had served in the Normandy region during this period had experienced unexplained financial improvements in the years following the war. Properties purchased, businesses established, and lifestyles adopted that seemed inconsistent with military salaries of the era. The most significant discovery came when Professor Hartwell gained access to recently declassified Swiss banking records from the 1940s. The neutral status of Swiss banks during World War II had made them attractive repositories for wealth of questionable origin, and post-war investigations had identified numerous accounts linked to Nazi officials and collaborators. These records show a series of large deposits made to numbered accounts during July and August 1944, Professor Hartwell explained. The amounts are substantial, each deposit equivalent to several $1,000,000 in today's currency. The timing correlates precisely with the disappearances of the tank crews. Margaret studied the banking documents carefully. This suggests that whatever Morrison and the other crews were transporting was divided into multiple shipments. Each crew carried a portion of the total treasure, and each successful transport resulted in another deposit to these secret accounts. Klaus provided historical context that helped explain how such a conspiracy could have operated. By June 1944, certain German officers understood that the war was lost. Some began making private arrangements to preserve their personal wealth and secure favorable treatment from the Allies. These arrangements would have required Allied partners willing to violate their military oaths for financial gain. Sarah had been quietly making phone calls to sources in Washington, and her efforts finally yielded a breakthrough. I've been in contact with a retired CIA analyst who specialized in post-war intelligence operations. He can't speak on the record, but he's confirmed that Operation Anvil Drop was real, and that files related to it remain classified at the highest levels of government. The anonymous source had provided Sarah with a crucial piece of information. Operation Anvil Drop had been authorized not by field commanders, but by a secret interagency committee that included representatives from the OSS, military intelligence, and what would later become the CIA. The operation's true purpose was to recover and redistribute Nazi treasure before it could be officially documented and returned to its rightful owners. According to my source, the participating Allied officers justified their actions as a form of war reparations, Sarah explained. They argued that the treasure they were appropriating would otherwise disappear into government bureaucracy or be returned to Nazi collaborators. They convinced themselves they were performing a patriotic service while enriching themselves. Professor Hartwell shook his head in disgust. Classic rationalization for criminal behavior. These men betrayed their oaths, murdered their own soldiers, and stole treasure that belonged to Holocaust victims and other Nazi targets. Margaret had been examining a Nazi gold certificate that Klaus had discovered among his wartime papers. Evidence that some German units had been involved in transporting looted wealth during the chaotic final months of the war. The certificate bore official Nazi markings but also contained handwritten notations in English, suggesting Allied personnel had been involved in cataloging and redistributing the stolen treasure. As evening approached, the group reviewed the evidence they had assembled. The picture that emerged was of a carefully orchestrated criminal conspiracy that had successfully operated for nearly 8 decades, protected by classification systems, destroyed records, and the natural reluctance of institutions to acknowledge such fundamental betrayals of trust. We now have documentary evidence, witness testimony, and financial records that prove Operation Anvil Drop was a systematic effort to steal Nazi treasure using Allied tank crews who were then murdered to prevent exposure, Professor Hartwell summarized. The question now is what we do with this information, knowing that powerful interests have been suppressing it for 79 years. The surveillance began subtly on a Tuesday morning. Margaret noticed the same dark sedan parked near the entrance to Pierre's farm for 3 consecutive days. Its occupants changing, but their attention to the farmhouse remaining constant. Her years of teaching had trained her to notice patterns and anomalies, and the presence of watchers was becoming impossible to ignore. Professor Hartwell's hotel room in nearby Cannes was searched while he attended a meeting at the local historical society. Nothing was taken, but his research materials had been carefully examined and photographed. The search was professional, conducted by individuals who knew how to investigate without leaving obvious traces. Only Professor Hartwell's methodical organization of his documents allowed him to detect that they had been disturbed. Sarah Morrison faced more direct intimidation. Her editor at the Washington Herald called to inform her that the newspaper had received pressure from government sources to kill her story about the missing tank crews. The pressure hadn't come through official channels, but rather through influential board members who had been contacted by individuals claiming national security concerns. "They're not trying to stop us through legal means," Sarah explained during an emergency meeting in Pierre's kitchen. "They're using influence networks and unofficial pressure. That suggests they can't rely on official classification systems to protect their secrets anymore." The situation escalated when Margaret received a visit from two men claiming to be representatives of the American Battle Monuments Commission. They arrived unannounced, wearing dark suits inappropriate for the rural French countryside, and requested to examine the artifacts she had discovered. Their credentials appeared authentic, but their knowledge of standard archaeological procedures was suspiciously limited. "Mrs. Walsh, we understand you've recovered materials that may be related to American war casualties," the older man explained. "The Commission has responsibility for ensuring that all battlefield recoveries are properly processed through official channels. We'll need to take custody of these items for authentication and cataloging." Margaret's response drew on 4 decades of experience dealing with authority figures who overestimated their influence over her. "Gentlemen, I've documented these finds according to proper archaeological standards, and they're currently being studied by qualified historians. If the Battle Monuments Commission has legitimate interest in these materials, they can submit a formal request through proper academic channels." The men exchanged glances that suggested Margaret's response wasn't what they had expected. The younger man attempted a more threatening approach. "Mrs. Walsh, you may not understand the sensitive nature of what you've discovered. Some wartime secrets remain classified for very good reasons. Continuing this investigation could have serious consequences for all involved." Pierre, who had been listening from the next room, chose that moment to appear with his hunting rifle, which he began cleaning with deliberate care. "Messrs, I think perhaps you should leave my property now. The lady has told you she is not interested in your request." After the men departed, Klaus Weber provided crucial insight into their behavior. Those men were not academics or government officials. Their approach was consistent with intelligence operatives or private security contractors. Someone with significant resources is monitoring your investigation. The turning point came when Margaret discovered bank transaction records from 1944, hidden in an old cigar box that Klaus had brought from Germany. The records documented a series of transfers between Swiss accounts and American banks during the months following D-Day. The amounts were staggering, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency, and the timing corresponded precisely with the dates when tank crews had disappeared. These records show that the stolen Nazi treasure wasn't just hidden. It was systematically laundered through legitimate banking systems, Professor Hartwell observed. This level of financial sophistication required cooperation from major banking institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Sarah's investigation into the current beneficiaries of these financial arrangements revealed disturbing connections to contemporary political and business leaders. Several prominent American families could trace their post-war prosperity to investments and property acquisitions that occurred during the precise time frame when the Nazi treasure was being redistributed. "We're not just documenting historical crimes," Sarah realized. "We're threatening the financial foundations of powerful families who have built their wealth on stolen Nazi gold. Their continued prosperity depends on keeping these secrets buried." The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but so was the pressure to abandon the investigation. Margaret's phone rang constantly with wrong numbers and hang-up calls. Professor Hartwell discovered that his university office had been entered multiple times, despite enhanced security measures. Klaus Weber reported that his hotel room had been searched and his rental car had been tampered with. Despite the intimidation, the group pressed forward with their research. Pierre's grandfather's diary, which had remained untranslated until Klaus offered his assistance, contained detailed accounts of witnessing Allied soldiers burying treasure in multiple locations throughout the Normandy countryside. The diary entries provided a roadmap for recovery operations that had apparently continued for months after the official end of combat operations. "My grandfather wrote that the American soldiers told him the gold was being buried temporarily until it could be properly distributed after the war," Pierre translated. "But the soldiers also warned him that knowledge of these burial sites was dangerous, and that people who talked about what they had seen tended to disappear." Margaret realized that Pierre's grandfather had lived for decades with the same fear that was now threatening their investigation. The old farmer had witnessed the beginning of a conspiracy that had successfully maintained itself for nearly 8 decades through intimidation, elimination of evidence, and the strategic placement of beneficiaries in positions of power and influence. As night fell over the Norman countryside, the group faced a critical decision. They possessed evidence that could rewrite World War II history and expose one of the longest-running criminal conspiracies in modern times. But they also understood that the forces arrayed against them had been successfully suppressing this information for 79 years and were unlikely to surrender their secrets without a fight. The escalation came without warning on a quiet Friday evening. Professor Hartwell returned to his hotel in Cannes to find his room completely ransacked. Unlike the previous subtle searches, this time the intruders had abandoned all pretense of stealth. Research files were scattered across the floor, his laptop computer was missing, and his carefully organized documentation of the investigation had been systematically destroyed. "They took everything," Professor Hartwell reported when he called Margaret. "Photographs, transcripts, copies of documents. 70 years of meticulous research destroyed in a single afternoon. But more troubling, they left behind a message. Someone wants us to know that this wasn't random theft." The message was simple and direct. A single sheet of paper placed prominently on the hotel room desk with typed words in English. "Some secrets are worth killing for. Others have already died to protect what you're trying to expose. Stop now while you still can." Margaret felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. The investigation had moved beyond academic research or historical curiosity. They were now directly threatening people who had successfully maintained a criminal conspiracy for 8 decades, and those people were responding with the same ruthless efficiency that had eliminated Harold Morrison's crew in 1944. Sarah Morrison's situation deteriorated simultaneously. Her editor called to inform her that the Washington Herald's board of directors had voted to kill her story entirely. The decision hadn't come through normal editorial channels, but rather through pressure applied directly to the newspaper's ownership by individuals who apparently possessed significant financial leverage over the publication. "They're not just suppressing the story," Sarah explained during an emergency video call with the group. "They're systematically destroying my credibility as a journalist. Someone has been spreading rumors about my research methods, questioning my objectivity because of my family connection to the story, and suggesting that I've fabricated evidence to support predetermined conclusions." Klaus Weber provided the most disturbing information of all. His contacts within German military historical societies had warned him that individuals claiming to represent American intelligence agencies had been making inquiries about his involvement in the investigation. The inquiries weren't official requests for information, but rather informal pressure applied to elderly veterans who might be reluctant to resist government authority. "They are trying to isolate us," Klaus observed with the tactical understanding of someone who had survived military and political conflicts for nearly 9 decades. "By destroying our research, discrediting our reputations, and intimidating our supporters, they hope to make the evidence disappear and leave us unable to present a coherent case to the public." The psychological pressure was beginning to affect everyone involved. Pierre's normally steady demeanor showed signs of strain as he worried about bringing danger to his farm and family. Margaret found herself constantly checking over her shoulder and jumping at unexpected sounds. Even Professor Hartwell, with his decades of experience in controversial historical research, admitted that he had never encountered opposition this sophisticated and determined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret's systematic documentation of her original discoveries had included precise GPS coordinates for every artifact recovery location. Using these coordinates, she had been conducting additional searches with her metal detector, working methodically through areas adjacent to her original finds. On a gray morning made darker by her growing anxiety about the investigation, Margaret's detector located a signal that was stronger and more consistent than anything she had previously encountered. Digging carefully, she uncovered what appeared to be a small waterproof container, deliberately buried but designed to be recovered by someone who knew its approximate location. Inside the container, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it for nearly 8 decades, was a collection of photographs that changed everything. The photographs showed Harold Morrison and his crew posing with wooden crates marked with Nazi symbols, but they also showed Allied officers, men in American uniforms with insignia indicating high rank, supervising the loading of these crates into Morrison's tank. These photographs prove that Morrison's crew wasn't stealing the Nazi treasure, Margaret realized as she studied the images. They were following direct orders from Allied command. Someone photographed the operation, probably as insurance or documentation. Professor Hartwell's analysis of the photographs confirmed Margaret's assessment. The uniforms, equipment, and vehicles all matched the time frame. But more importantly, these images show that the theft of Nazi treasure was an officially sanctioned Allied operation, not a rogue action by individual soldiers. Klaus Weber studied the photographs with particular interest, focusing on details that others might miss. The German markings on these crates indicate they contained more than gold. According to Nazi documentation systems, these symbols represent collections of artwork, jewelry, and other cultural treasures stolen from occupied territories and Holocaust victims. Sarah Morrison understood the implications immediately. If Allied command officially ordered the theft of Holocaust treasure, and then executed the crews to cover up the crime, this isn't just a story about wartime corruption. This is evidence of systematic betrayal of everything the Allied cause claimed to represent. The photographs also revealed why the cover-up had been so successful and so enduring. Several of the Allied officers visible in the images bore strong resemblances to men who would later become prominent in post-war American government and business. The conspiracy hadn't ended with the war, it had provided the foundation for decades of political and economic influence. As Margaret carefully repackaged the photographs for safekeeping, she understood that the group now possessed evidence that could destroy not just individual reputations, but entire family dynasties built on the foundation of stolen Holocaust treasure. The stakes had risen far beyond historical accuracy to encompass justice for crimes that had remained unpunished for nearly 8 decades. The scope of the conspiracy became clear when Sarah Morrison's research into post-war intelligence operations revealed connections that reached into the highest levels of American government. Working from backup files she had stored in a secure location, Sarah had been tracing the careers of Allied officers who appeared in Morrison's hidden photographs. What she discovered was a network of influence that had shaped American foreign policy for decades. 3 of the officers in those photographs went on to senior positions in the newly formed CIA, Sarah reported during a secure video conference with the team. 2 others became prominent businessmen with extensive government contracts. 1 became a federal judge. These weren't just random soldiers who got away with a crime. They used their stolen wealth to buy influence and power. Professor Hartwell had been working through academic channels to access additional classified documents, using his reputation and connections to gain entry to archives that were normally restricted to government researchers. His persistence had yielded a crucial discovery, an OSS planning document that laid out the complete structure of Operation Anvil Drop. The document was heavily redacted, but the visible portions revealed that the operation had been conceived at the highest levels of Allied intelligence as a way to secure funding for post-war covert operations. The logic was coldly pragmatic. Nazi treasure that would otherwise disappear into government bureaucracy could be redirected to fund intelligence activities that wouldn't require congressional approval or oversight. This wasn't just theft for personal enrichment, Professor Hartwell explained. It was the foundation for what would become decades of unacknowledged intelligence operations. The stolen Nazi treasure provided seed money for activities that shaped the entire Cold War. Klaus Weber's analysis of the German side of the operation provided crucial context for understanding how such extensive cooperation had been possible. His research into Wehrmacht and SS records revealed that certain German officers had been promised protection from war crimes prosecution in exchange for facilitating Allied access to Nazi treasure caches. The arrangements went far beyond simple battlefield surrender, Klaus explained. Some German officers provided detailed maps of treasure locations, access to transportation networks, and even personnel to assist in recovery operations. In return, they received new identities and safe passage to South America or other havens. Margaret's methodical approach to investigating the burial sites had yielded additional evidence that supported Klaus's research. Using Morrison's modified compass and the coordinates from his hidden photographs, she had located 3 additional cache sites on Pierre's property. Each site contained evidence of systematic treasure recovery operations that had continued for months after the official end of combat. The most significant discovery was a partially burned logbook that documented the movement of treasure from multiple Nazi caches to Allied collection points. The logbook was written in English, suggesting it had been maintained by American personnel, and it detailed quantities of gold, artwork, and jewelry that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in value. Pierre had been invaluable in translating conversations. He remembered his grandfather having with other local farmers who had witnessed similar activities. Many of the old men in this region saw American soldiers digging and burying things during the summer of 1944, Pierre reported. They were told it was military equipment being stored for future operations, but my grandfather always suspected it was something more valuable. Sarah's journalism background proved crucial when she discovered that several major American art museums and private collections contained pieces that could be traced to Nazi looting operations. Her investigation revealed a pattern of acquisitions during the late 1940s and early 1950s that suggested systematic laundering of stolen cultural treasures through legitimate institutions. We're not just talking about gold bars hidden in Swiss banks, Sarah realized. We're looking at stolen artwork hanging in American museums, jewelry collections passed down through prominent families, and cultural treasures that should have been returned to Holocaust survivors or their families. The web of complicity extended further than anyone had initially imagined. Professor Hartwell's research revealed that several major universities had received anonymous donations during the post-war period that funded the establishment of research programs and endowments. The timing and amounts of these donations suggested they may have been financed by treasure stolen from Nazi caches. Klaus Weber provided the final piece of the puzzle when he produced a secret agreement between Allied and German intelligence officers that had been hidden in his personal papers for nearly 8 decades. The document outlined a comprehensive plan for sharing information, resources, and personnel between former enemies in preparation for the emerging conflict with Soviet communism. Both sides understood that the war against Nazi Germany was ending, but a new war against Soviet Russia was beginning, Klaus explained. The treasure theft wasn't just about personal enrichment or funding covert operations. It was about creating the financial foundation for what you Americans would call the military-industrial complex. Margaret studied the secret agreement with growing horror. The document revealed that Operation Anvil Drop had been part of a larger strategy to recruit Nazi scientists, intelligence officers, and other personnel for use against the Soviet Union. The stolen treasure had provided funding for this recruitment program, while the murder of tank crews like Morrison's had ensured that evidence of collaboration with Nazi war criminals remained hidden. Harold Morrison and his crew weren't just witnesses to theft, Margaret realized. They were witnesses to treason. They saw American officers making deals with Nazi war criminals, and they had to be eliminated to protect not just individual reputations, but the entire post-war intelligence establishment. The investigation had evolved from a historical mystery into documentation of one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in modern history. The evidence they had assembled threatened not just individual families or institutions, but the foundational narratives of American Cold War heroism and moral authority. The truth began to emerge when Margaret received an unexpected visitor on a cold Wednesday morning. William Bill Patterson arrived at Pierre's farm driving a modest sedan, his 98-year-old frame moving slowly but purposefully as he approached the farmhouse. He introduced himself as a retired OSS officer who had been following their investigation through contacts in the intelligence community. Mrs. Walsh, I've carried the burden of what I know about Operation Anvil Drop for 79 years, Bill said, his voice still strong despite his advanced age. I was one of the planners of that operation, and I've lived with the guilt of what we did ever since. When I learned that someone had finally uncovered evidence of the truth, I knew it was time to break my silence. Professor Hartwell immediately recognized the significance of Bill's appearance. Surviving OSS officers from World War II were extremely rare, and those with direct knowledge of classified operations were rarer still. If Bill Patterson was willing to speak honestly about Operation Anvil Drop, his testimony could provide the missing pieces of the puzzle they had been assembling. Bill's account began with the context that had made Operation Anvil Drop seem necessary to its planners. In early 1944, Allied intelligence had discovered that Nazi Germany possessed far more looted treasure than anyone had previously estimated. The treasure wasn't just gold and jewelry. It included artwork, rare books, scientific instruments, and cultural artifacts stolen from across occupied Europe. We knew that if this treasure fell into Soviet hands when Germany collapsed, it would disappear forever, Bill explained. Stalin's forces were already looting everything they could find in occupied territories. Our superiors believed that recovering the Nazi treasure was a race against time, and that conventional military and diplomatic channels would be too slow. Sarah Morrison had been taking detailed notes throughout Bill's account, but she interrupted with the question that had been troubling her since the investigation began. Mr. Patterson, why were the tank crews killed? Why not simply swear them to secrecy or transfer them to other duties? Bill's expression grew pained as he addressed the question that had haunted him for decades. The decision to eliminate the tank crews wasn't part of the original operation plan. It was a modification made after we discovered how extensive the Nazi treasure network actually was. The planners realized that the theft would continue for months, possibly years, and that maintaining operational security with living witnesses would be impossible. Klaus Weber had been listening intently to Bill's account, and he provided corroboration from the German perspective. Wehrmacht intelligence reported unusual Allied interest in Nazi treasure locations beginning in early 1944. We assumed it was standard intelligence gathering, but the level of detail and the specific locations suggested insider knowledge. Bill nodded grimly. We had German sources providing information about treasure locations. Some were Nazi officials trying to buy favorable treatment after the war. Others were Wehrmacht officers who understood that Germany had lost and wanted to ensure their survival. The cooperation was extensive and systematic. Margaret examined the collection of evidence she had gathered, which now included Morrison's hidden photographs, bank records, and Bill Patterson's first-hand testimony. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. It involved multiple levels of Allied command, German intelligence sources, Swiss banking institutions, and post-war American government and business establishments. Mr. Patterson, how many tank crews were eliminated as part of Operation Anvil Drop? Professor Hartwell asked. Bill's answer was delivered with obvious pain. Morrison's crew was the first, but they weren't the last. Over the course of 6 months, 7 tank crews were murdered to protect the operation. 41 American soldiers died to cover up the theft of Nazi treasure. Each crew believed they were following legitimate military orders until the moment they were betrayed. Pierre had been translating the conversation for his own understanding, and he suddenly interrupted with urgent French. When Margaret asked for translation, Pierre explained that his grandfather's diary contained entries about American soldiers visiting the farm during autumn 1944, months after the official end of combat operations in the area. My grandfather wrote that the Americans came at night, always in small groups, always carrying shovels and equipment for digging. He counted at least 12 separate visits between August and December 1944. Each time, they buried or recovered items from different locations on the property. Sarah's investigation into the financial aspects of the conspiracy had revealed that the stolen treasure had been systematically laundered through a network of Swiss banks, American financial institutions, and European art dealers. The operation had generated hundreds of millions of dollars in funding that had been used to establish the foundation for post-war intelligence operations. The money from Operation Anvil Drop funded the creation of what would become the CIA, Sarah realized. It paid for recruitment of Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip, financed covert operations in Europe and Latin America, and provided seed money for the military-industrial complex that dominated American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. Bill Patterson's testimony confirmed Sarah's analysis. The stolen Nazi treasure became the secret budget for American intelligence operations. It allowed us to conduct activities that Congress would never have approved, to recruit personnel that democratic oversight would have rejected, and to establish relationships with former enemies that public opinion would have condemned. Margaret understood that they now possessed complete documentation of one of the largest criminal conspiracies in modern history. Operation Anvil Drop hadn't been an isolated wartime crime. It had been the foundation for decades of unacknowledged American intelligence activities that had shaped global politics throughout the second half of the 20th century. The evidence was overwhelming, But so was the realization that exposing the truth would challenge fundamental assumptions about American moral authority and the legitimacy of post-war international order. The revelation came as Bill Patterson reached into his briefcase and produced a document that changed everything the investigation team thought they knew about Harold Morrison's fate. The paper was yellowed with age but still clearly legible. A hand-drawn survival map marked with Morrison's initials and dated June 13, 1944, one day after his official disappearance. "Harold Morrison didn't die with his crew," Bill said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 8 decades of secrecy. "He escaped the ambush that killed his men, and he's been living in hiding ever since, gathering evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose the truth." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the entire investigation. "Mr. Patterson, are you telling us that Harold Morrison is still alive?" Bill nodded slowly. "He's 99 years old now, living under an assumed identity in a small town in Montana. He contacted me 3 months ago when he learned that someone had finally discovered evidence in the Normandy fields. He's been watching your investigation, Mrs. Walsh, through contacts he maintained in the veteran community." Professor Hartwell struggled to process the implications. If Morrison survived and has been collecting evidence for 79 years, he would possess documentation that could prove every aspect of Operation Anvil Drop. He would be the ultimate witness. Sarah Morrison's emotions were overwhelming as she realized that her grandfather, the man her family had mourned for nearly 8 decades, was not only alive but had been secretly fighting to expose the truth about his murdered crew. How did he escape? Why didn't he come forward sooner? Bill Patterson's explanation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that Morrison had been fighting against. On the night of June 12, 1944, Morrison and his crew had been ordered to transport a cargo of Nazi treasure to coordinates that would supposedly be a secure Allied depot. Instead, they were led into an ambush by Allied soldiers who had been ordered to eliminate all witnesses to the treasure theft. Morrison was thrown clear when his tank hit a concealed explosive device, Bill explained. His crew was killed instantly, but Harold survived with serious injuries. He witnessed Allied soldiers, men wearing American uniforms, systematically destroying evidence and preparing false reports about German artillery strikes. The survival map showed Morrison's route through the Norman countryside as he evaded both German and Allied forces while recovering from his injuries. Local French resistance fighters had found him and, believing him to be an escaped prisoner of war, had helped him reach safety. Morrison had eventually made contact with British intelligence, but when he attempted to report what he had witnessed, he discovered that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of Allied command. Harold realized that coming forward officially would result in his death, Bill continued. Instead, he accepted a new identity provided by sympathetic British officers and spent the war years working as a liaison with French resistance groups. After the war, he emigrated to America under his assumed name and began the long process of documenting the conspiracy. Klaus Weber had been listening with intense interest, and he suddenly remembered encountering reports of an American tank commander who had worked with resistance forces during the final months of the war. There were rumors among German intelligence about an American officer who operated behind our lines, but we assumed he was a conventional spy or saboteur. Margaret examined the survival map carefully. Morrison's notations included detailed observations about the Allied officers who had orchestrated the ambush, descriptions of the treasure being transported, and coordinates for multiple burial sites throughout the Normandy region. The map was essentially a treasure hunter's guide created by the one person who had witnessed the entire operation firsthand. "Mr. Patterson, how do we know that Morrison is willing to come forward now?" Professor Hartwell asked. "After maintaining his secrecy for 79 years, what has changed?" Bill reached into his briefcase again and produced a sealed envelope addressed to Margaret Walsh. "Harold has been following your investigation since you first discovered his dog tags. He's impressed by your methodical approach and your commitment to historical truth. He's also 99 years old and understands that time is running out for justice." Sarah Morrison's hands trembled as she considered the possibility of meeting the grandfather she had never known, the man whose disappearance had shaped her family's entire history. What evidence has he collected over all these years? Bill's answer revealed the scope of Morrison's decades. Long investigation. Harold has copies of Operation Anvil Drop planning documents, photographs of the treasure recovery operations, financial records showing how the stolen wealth was laundered, and detailed dossiers on every Allied officer involved in the conspiracy. He's also maintained contact with other survivors, French resistance fighters, British intelligence officers, even some German personnel who were disgusted by the collaboration. The sealed envelope contained Morrison's personal message to Margaret, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had spent decades documenting evidence. The letter thanked her for bringing the truth to light and included coordinates for a meeting location where Morrison would finally break his silence and provide complete documentation of Operation Anvil Drop. "Mrs. Walsh, you've accomplished something I thought was impossible," Bill Patterson said as Margaret finished reading the letter. "You've created conditions where Harold Morrison can finally tell his story without being immediately silenced by the forces that have been hunting him for 79 years. Margaret realized that the investigation had reached a turning point. They were no longer just documenting historical crimes. They were about to confront the living survivor of those crimes and gain access to evidence that could rewrite not just World War II history, but the entire narrative of post-war American intelligence operations. The prospect of meeting Harold Morrison was both thrilling and terrifying, because his testimony would transform their academic investigation into a direct challenge to some of the most powerful institutions in American government and society. The meeting took place in a small cafe in the Montana town of Whitefish, far from the Normandy fields where the investigation had begun. Margaret had flown to America with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, carrying copies of all the evidence they had assembled. Sarah Morrison had arrived the previous day, struggling with emotions she couldn't fully articulate about meeting the grandfather she had mourned her entire life. Harold Morrison entered the cafe with the careful movements of a man who had spent decades looking over his shoulder. At 99, he was smaller than his wartime photographs suggested, but his eyes retained the sharp intelligence that had allowed him to survive 8 decades of hiding. He wore a simple brown jacket and carried a worn leather briefcase that seemed to contain the weight of nearly a century of secrets. "Mrs. Walsh," Harold said as he approached their table, his voice carrying traces of the Brooklyn accent that Bill Patterson had mentioned. "I've been following your work since you first uncovered my dog tags. You've done something remarkable. You've forced the truth out of hiding after all these years." Sarah Morrison struggled to find words as she faced the grandfather who had been officially dead since before her birth. Harold studied her face with obvious emotion, seeing echoes of family resemblances that had been preserved across 3 generations. "You look like your grandmother," Harold said softly. "Jenny would have been proud to see what a strong woman you've become. I'm sorry I couldn't be part of your life, but staying hidden was the only way to stay alive long enough to see justice done." Harold's briefcase contained what he called his 79-year evidence collection, a comprehensive archive of documents, photographs, and testimony that he had assembled through decades of careful investigation. The collection included original Operation Anvil Drop planning documents that Bill Patterson had helped him obtain, financial records showing the flow of stolen Nazi treasure through various institutions, and detailed profiles of every Allied officer involved in the conspiracy. "I've spent my entire adult life documenting this crime," Harold explained as he spread materials across the cafe table. "Every year, I thought maybe this would be the year when conditions would allow me to come forward safely. But the conspiracy was too powerful, too well protected by classification systems and institutional interests." Margaret examined Harold's documentation with growing amazement. His collection was far more comprehensive than anything their investigation had uncovered. He possessed complete records of all 7 tank crews that had been eliminated, detailed maps of treasure burial and recovery sites, and evidence of how the stolen wealth had been used to fund covert operations throughout the Cold War. "Harold, why didn't you try to contact authorities immediately after the war?" Professor Hartwell asked during a video call from France. Harold's laugh was bitter. "Professor, the authorities were the ones trying to kill me. When I attempted to report what I had witnessed to Allied Command in 1944, I discovered that the orders for my crew's elimination had come from the highest levels of American intelligence. Trying to work through official channels would have been suicide." Sarah Morrison had been studying photographs of her grandfather's murdered crew, men she had heard about in family stories but never seen in wartime images. What happened to the other crew members' families? Do they know the truth about how their fathers and sons died? Harold's expression grew pained. Most of the families accepted the official story about enemy artillery. A few suspected something was wrong, but they lacked evidence and were discouraged from pursuing investigations. I maintained secret contact with some of them over the years, providing anonymous tips when I could, but I couldn't risk revealing my survival. The scope of Harold's knowledge was staggering. He had identified the current locations of major art collections that contained pieces stolen from Holocaust victims, tracked the descendants of Allied officers who had built family fortunes on Nazi treasure, and documented ongoing efforts to suppress evidence of Operation Anvil Drop. The conspiracy didn't end with the war, Harold explained. The stolen treasure became the foundation for a network of influence that shaped American politics and foreign policy for decades. Exposing the truth threatens not just individual reputations, but the legitimacy of major institutions. Klaus Weber, participating in the conversation by phone from Germany, provided confirmation of Harold's account from the Wehrmacht perspective. Herr Morrison, our intelligence reports from 1944 mentioned an American tank commander who had gone native with French resistance forces. We assumed you were a deserter or a spy, but your true situation was far more complex. Harold nodded. I worked with the resistance for the final months of the war, helping to document Nazi war crimes and locate treasure caches. The French fighters who saved my life became my allies in understanding the full scope of what the Allies and Germans were doing together. Margaret realized that Harold Morrison represented more than just a witness to historical crimes. He embodied decades of patient determination to see justice done, regardless of personal cost. His evidence collection was the product of a lifetime spent in the shadows, waiting for the moment when truth could finally overcome institutional power. What happens now? Sarah asked her grandfather. How do we ensure that your evidence reaches the public without being suppressed the way it has been for 79 years? The revelation that transformed their strategy came when Harold Morrison produced a collection of modern communications that proved the cover-up was not just historical, but actively ongoing. Among his carefully preserved documents were intercepted emails, recorded phone conversations, and financial transactions showing that contemporary government officials were still working to suppress evidence of Operation Anvil Drop. The conspiracy didn't die with the original participants, Harold explained as he showed them transcripts of recent communications. Their children and grandchildren inherited both the stolen wealth and the responsibility for protecting the family secrets. Some current officials in the Pentagon, CIA, and State Department are direct descendants of the men who ordered my crew's execution. Sarah Morrison studied the intercepted communications with her journalist's eye for significant details. The documents revealed coordination between government agencies, private security firms, and wealthy families to monitor and suppress any investigation into wartime treasure theft. The same network that had eliminated Harold's crew in 1944 was still operating in 2023, using modern surveillance and influence techniques. These communications show they've been tracking our investigation from the beginning, Sarah realized. The threatening phone calls, the hotel room searches, the pressure on my newspaper. It's all coordinated by people who have inherited the responsibility for keeping these secrets buried. Margaret examined financial records showing recent payments to private investigators, security consultants, and legal firms specializing in suppressing unwanted publicity. The amounts were substantial, suggesting that protecting the Operation Anvil Drop secrets remained a high priority for powerful interests nearly 8 decades after the original crimes. Professor Hartwell, participating by secure video call, was amazed by the sophistication of the ongoing cover-up. Harold, how did you obtain these modern communications? This level of intelligence gathering would require significant resources and technical expertise. Harold's smile carried the satisfaction of a man who had outmaneuvered his enemies for nearly a century. Professor, I've had 79 years to develop contacts and capabilities. When you're fighting a conspiracy that powerful, you learn to build your own network of allies. Some of these documents came from sympathetic intelligence officers who were disgusted by what they discovered in classified files. The intercepted communications revealed specific names of current officials who were actively working to suppress the Operation Anvil Drop evidence. Several held positions in agencies responsible for declassifying historical documents, while others worked in oversight committees that controlled access to sensitive military archives. "We're not just fighting historical denial," Harold observed. "We're confronting people who have the power to classify documents, destroy evidence, and eliminate threats to their family legacies. They've been using government resources to protect private interests for decades." Klaus Weber's contribution to the conversation provided crucial validation of Harold's claims about ongoing suppression efforts. German archives had recently experienced mysterious requests for documents related to wartime treasure operations, followed by attempts to restrict access to materials that might corroborate Harold's account. "Someone with official authority has been systematically removing evidence from German archives," Klaus reported. "Documents that existed 5 years ago are now missing or reclassified. The pattern suggests coordination between American and German officials to sanitize the historical record." Sarah Morrison's investigation into the financial aspects of the modern cover-up revealed that several major charitable foundations and cultural institutions were receiving funding from families whose wealth could be traced to Operation Anvil Drop. The donations created networks of obligation that discouraged investigation into the sources of the benefactors' wealth. "They're using philanthropy to buy silence," Sarah realized. Museums, universities, and research institutions that might otherwise investigate Nazi treasure theft are receiving donations from the families who profited from that theft. It's a systematic conflict of interest that protects the conspiracy. Margaret studied the scope of Harold's evidence collection and understood that they now possessed documentation that could expose not just the original World War II crimes, but decades of ongoing criminal activity by government officials who had used their positions to protect family secrets. "Harold, why reveal all of this now?" Margaret asked. "You've successfully hidden this evidence for nearly 8 decades. What changed?" Harold's expression grew solemn. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm 99 years old. I won't live much longer. And when I die, this evidence dies with me unless we act now. More importantly, the current generation of officials involved in the cover-up is making mistakes. They're overconfident after decades of success, and they're using modern communications that can be intercepted and documented." The planning session that followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in her academic career. Instead of discussing historical interpretation or scholarly publication, they were organizing a coordinated release of evidence designed to overcome sophisticated suppression efforts by powerful government and private interests. "We need to release everything simultaneously across multiple platforms," Sarah proposed. "International media, academic institutions, government oversight committees, and social media. All at the same time so they can't suppress the story before it gains momentum." Harold Morrison's 79-year investigation was finally approaching its culmination, but the team understood that exposing the truth would require confronting forces that had successfully maintained their secrets through intimidation, influence, and violence for nearly 8 decades. The coordinated release began at precisely 6 a.m. Eastern Time on a Tuesday morning, timed to maximize impact across multiple time zones and media cycles. Sarah Morrison had spent weeks building relationships with journalists at major international news organizations, ensuring that the story would break simultaneously in newspapers and television broadcasts across 3 continents. Margaret Walsh had worked with Professor Hartwell to prepare academic documentation that would meet the highest scholarly standards, submitting their findings to peer-reviewed historical journals and university archives. The academic community's involvement was crucial for establishing the credibility and legitimacy of their evidence. Harold Morrison's complete archive was uploaded to secure servers operated by WikiLeaks and several other document-sharing organizations, ensuring that the evidence would remain accessible even if government agencies attempted to suppress it through legal or technical means. The 79-year collection included original documents, photographs, and recordings that provided irrefutable proof of Operation Anvil Drop and its ongoing cover-up. The first attempts at suppression began within hours of the initial release. Sarah Morrison received urgent calls from her editors at the Washington Herald, informing her that the newspaper's board of directors was meeting in emergency session to consider killing the story. Similar pressure was being applied to news organizations in London, Paris, and Berlin. "They're using every tool in their playbook," Sarah reported during a secure conference call with the team. "Legal threats, economic pressure, claims of national security violations. Everything we expected based on Harold's research into their suppression methods. But the coordinated nature of the release made suppression impossible. By midday, the story was trending on social media platforms, being discussed on international news broadcasts, and generating responses from government officials who were clearly unprepared for such comprehensive exposure of classified information. Professor Hartwell's contacts in the academic community proved invaluable for maintaining momentum. University historians are confirming our findings and demanding access to classified archives, he reported. The scholarly legitimacy of our research is making it difficult for officials to dismiss this as conspiracy theory or sensationalism. Klaus Weber's contribution from Germany provided crucial international perspective that prevented the story from being characterized as an exclusively American issue. German news organizations were highlighting the collaboration between Nazi and Allied officials, while Jewish advocacy groups were demanding investigation into the theft of Holocaust treasure. The breakthrough came when Harold Morrison agreed to appear on live television for the first time in 79 years. The interview, conducted simultaneously on networks in the United States, Britain, and Germany, featured the 99-year-old survivor telling his story in his own words, with documentary evidence displayed alongside his testimony. "I've been waiting 79 years for this moment," Harold said during the broadcast. "My crew, Robert Chen, James Patterson, Michael O'Brien, and David Walsh, were murdered by their own command to cover up the theft of treasure stolen from Holocaust victims. I survived that betrayal, and I've spent my entire life gathering evidence to prove that these men were heroes who died because they discovered that their officers were criminals." The live broadcast made suppression impossible. Harold's credibility as a 99-year-old veteran, combined with the documentary evidence he presented, created an emotional and factual impact that resonated with audiences worldwide. Social media amplified his testimony, with millions of viewers sharing clips and demanding government investigations. Margaret watched the interview from her hotel room in Montana, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension as decades of careful historical research transformed into a moment of global reckoning. The evidence she had discovered with her metal detector in a French farmer's field was now challenging fundamental narratives about World War II and post-war American foreign policy. The government response revealed the accuracy of Harold's predictions about ongoing cover-up efforts. Within hours of the broadcast, officials were claiming that much of the evidence was classified for national security reasons and couldn't be verified or discussed publicly. The defensive posture confirmed that the conspiracy Harold had been fighting remained active and powerful. But the momentum was building beyond the control of any suppression effort. International organizations began announcing investigations, congressional committees called for hearings, and victims' advocacy groups demanded justice for families whose stolen treasure had never been recovered or returned. Sarah Morrison received confirmation that her story would be published despite pressure from the Washington Herald's board of directors. Other news organizations were committing to continued coverage, and documentary filmmakers were already requesting interviews with the investigation team. "We've broken through their ability to control the narrative," Sarah realized during their evening debriefing. "The story is too big, too well documented, and too emotionally compelling for them to suppress through traditional methods." Harold Morrison's archive had become public record, accessible to researchers, journalists, and investigators worldwide. The truth about Operation Inville Drop was finally emerging from 8 decades of secrecy, carrying implications that extended far beyond historical accuracy to questions of justice, accountability, and the moral foundations of post-war international order. The final confrontation was just beginning, but for the first time in 79 years, Harold Morrison and the memory of his murdered crew were winning the battle against the forces that had tried to erase them from history. The international outcry that followed Harold Morrison's television appearance created a momentum that proved impossible for even the most powerful interests to contain. Within 72 hours of the broadcast, governments across 3 continents were facing demands for investigations, declassification of records, and accountability for decades of suppression. The tipping point came when the German government announced that it would immediately declassify all World War II documents related to treasure recovery operations, regardless of agreements with other nations to keep such materials secret. Chancellor Mueller's statement was unambiguous. The German people have a right to know the complete truth about how Nazi crimes were exploited by both German and Allied officials for personal enrichment. Sarah Morrison-Chan's investigation had revealed that several current American officials were direct descendants of Operation Anvil Drop participants, and their positions in government agencies created clear conflicts of interest. Congressional oversight committees, responding to public pressure, announced they would subpoena these officials to testify under oath about their families' wartime activities and their roles in ongoing suppression efforts. Margaret Walsh found herself testifying before a joint House-Senate committee investigating wartime treasure theft and post-war cover-ups. Her methodical presentation of the archaeological evidence, combined with Professor Hartwell's historical analysis and Harold Morrison's eyewitness testimony, created an irrefutable case that impressed even skeptical legislators. The evidence shows systematic theft of treasure belonging to Holocaust victims, followed by the murder of American soldiers to prevent exposure, and an ongoing conspiracy to suppress this information that has persisted for 79 years, Margaret testified. This isn't just historical wrongdoing. It's an active criminal enterprise that has used government resources to protect private interests. The pressure for accountability reached a breaking point when Swiss banking authorities, responding to international demands, announced they would release records of all accounts established with Nazi treasure during and after World War II. The financial documentation provided concrete proof of how stolen wealth had been laundered through legitimate institutions and used to establish family fortunes that persisted into the present day. Klaus Weber's testimony before the German parliament provided crucial corroboration from the Wehrmacht perspective, while his presentation of captured documents proved that the conspiracy had involved the highest levels of both German and Allied command. His advanced age and obvious sincerity made his account particularly compelling to legislators and media audiences. The breakthrough came when the State Department, facing overwhelming pressure from Congress and international allies, announced it would declassify all documents related to Operation Anvil Drop and similar wartime activities. The announcement represented a complete reversal of decades of classification policy and suggested that the cost of continued suppression had finally exceeded the cost of disclosure. Professor Hartwell worked with international historians to establish a commission for investigating wartime treasure theft and ensuring that recovered assets were returned to victims' families or appropriate memorial organizations. The commission's work revealed that Operation Anvil Drop had been part of a much larger pattern of theft that had affected multiple countries and thousands of families. Harold Morrison's role in the unfolding investigations was particularly significant because his survival and testimony provided living proof of crimes that officials had assumed were safely buried in the past. His willingness to testify publicly, despite the personal risks involved, inspired other survivors and witnesses to come forward with additional evidence. The document that proved most damaging to the conspiracy was an official government apology issued by the Department of Defense, acknowledging that American forces had participated in the theft of Nazi treasure and the murder of Allied personnel to cover up these crimes. The apology represented the first official acknowledgement of Operation Anvil Drop and established government responsibility for investigating and remedying the consequences of these actions. The United States government acknowledges that members of the Allied command participated in criminal activities including theft of cultural treasures and the execution of American military personnel, the statement read. These actions violated military law, international conventions, and the moral principles for which our forces were fighting. We commit to full investigation, accountability, and restitution to affected families. Sarah Morrison-Chan's reporting on the government's response revealed the extent to which contemporary officials had been willing to perpetuate the cover-up. Her investigation showed that classification decisions, archive restrictions, and budget allocations had been systematically manipulated to prevent disclosure of Operation Anvil Drop evidence. Margaret observed the rapidly changing landscape with amazement at how quickly decades of secrecy could unravel once the truth gained sufficient momentum. The artifacts she had discovered in Pierre's field had triggered an avalanche of revelations that was reshaping understanding of World War II history and post-war American foreign policy. The families of Morrison's murdered crew members were finally receiving official acknowledgement of how their loved ones had actually died, while descendants of Holocaust victims were learning that stolen family treasures had been used to build American political and business empires. Klaus Weber's contribution to the historical record was particularly valuable because it demonstrated that some participants in wartime crimes had spent decades seeking opportunities to make amends for their actions. His cooperation with the investigation showed that accountability was possible even after extended periods of secrecy. The momentum for justice was building beyond anyone's ability to control, but the team understood that ensuring lasting change would require continued vigilance against attempts to minimize or forget the significance of what they had exposed. 6 months after the story broke, a solemn ceremony took place in the Norman countryside where Margaret Walsh had made her first discovery. The memorial service honored Harold Morrison's crew and the other soldiers who had been murdered to protect Operation Anvil Drop, finally giving them the recognition that had been denied for 79 years. Harold Morrison, now 100 years old, stood with remarkable steadiness as he spoke about his fallen comrades. Robert Chun was 22 when he died, a gunner who dreamed of opening a restaurant after the war. James Patterson was a farm boy from Iowa who could fix any mechanical problem. Michael O'Brien wrote poetry in his spare time and sent it home to his sweetheart. David Walsh was our radio operator, a kid from Boston who made us laugh even when we were scared. The memorial plaque, erected at the exact location where Margaret had found Morrison's dog tags, bore the names of all 41 soldiers who had been killed to protect the conspiracy. The inscription read, "In memory of Allied soldiers murdered by their own command while serving the cause of freedom. Their sacrifice exposed crimes that remained hidden for 8 decades. Truth honored. Justice served." Sarah Morrison delivered a eulogy for the grandfather she had finally come to know, speaking about the courage required to survive in hiding while fighting for justice across nearly 8 decades. Harold Morrison lost his youth, his identity, and his family to protect evidence that would eventually expose one of the longest criminal conspiracies in modern history. He gave up everything so that someday the truth would be known. Margaret Walsh had been asked to speak about the investigation that had brought the truth to light. Standing before an audience that included government officials, historians, and family members of the victims, she reflected on how a simple metal-detecting expedition had evolved into a global reckoning with historical crimes. The artifacts buried in this field were left by men who knew they were about to die for discovering the truth, Margaret said. Harold Morrison and his crew were murdered because they witnessed American officers stealing treasure that belonged to Holocaust victims. But Harold's survival and his 79 years of patient evidence gathering ensured that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Professor Hartwell had worked with international historians to establish the Morrison Foundation for Historical Truth, an organization dedicated to investigating other instances of wartime crimes that had been covered up by powerful interests. The Foundation's first project involved tracing additional Nazi treasure that had been stolen by Allied forces and used to fund post-war intelligence operations. Klaus Weber, despite his advanced age, had become an important advocate for truth and reconciliation between former enemies. His testimony about German cooperation with Allied treasure theft had helped demonstrate that the corruption of war affected soldiers on all sides. Crimes were committed by German officers and Allied officers working together for personal gain, Klaus observed. Acknowledgement of these crimes by both sides is necessary for true historical understanding. The ceremony attracted international attention, with news crews documenting the formal recognition of crimes that had been denied for nearly 8 decades. The visual impact of Harold Morrison, at 100 years old, finally receiving justice for his murdered crew created powerful imagery that resonated with audiences worldwide. Pierre Dubois had donated the portion of his farm where the artifacts were discovered to serve as a permanent memorial site and research center. The land would be preserved as a reminder of how ordinary citizens could uncover extraordinary crimes through careful investigation and persistent pursuit of truth. The memorial service concluded with the reading of newly declassified documents showing the full scope of Operation Anvil Drop and its aftermath. Government officials who had participated in the cover-up were named publicly for the first time, while families of victims received official acknowledgement of how their loved ones had actually died. Sarah Morrison's reporting on the memorial service emphasized the broader implications of the case for understanding how powerful interests had used classification systems and institutional authority to suppress evidence of criminal activity. Her articles had sparked similar investigations in other countries, revealing patterns of wartime crimes that had been hidden for decades. Margaret Walsh found herself appointed as curator of a new exhibit at the Normandy American Cemetery, dedicated to telling the complete story of D-Day and its aftermath, including the crimes that had been committed by some Allied personnel. The exhibit would ensure that future generations understood both the heroism and the corruption that had occurred during the liberation of Europe. Harold Morrison's final public appearance was at the memorial service, where he expressed satisfaction that his crew's story had finally been told completely and accurately. "I've lived to see justice done," he said. "Robert, James, Michael, and David can finally rest in peace, knowing that their sacrifice exposed the truth and ensured that such crimes can never again be hidden from history." The memorial plaque would stand as permanent testimony to the power of persistence in pursuing historical truth, and as a warning about the dangers of allowing powerful interests to suppress evidence of their crimes through intimidation and institutional authority. 1 year after the memorial service, Margaret Walsh stood in her study in Yorkshire, surrounded by correspondence from historians, journalists, and family members whose lives had been changed by the revelations about Operation Anvil Drop. The investigation that had begun with a simple metal detecting expedition had evolved into a global movement for historical accountability and truth. Harold Morrison had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months after the memorial service, having lived to see complete vindication for his crew and the exposure of the conspiracy that had haunted him for 8 decades. His final letter to future generations had been preserved as part of the permanent record, serving as both testimony and warning about the price of institutional secrecy. The letter, written in Harold's careful handwriting just weeks before his death, captured the essence of his extraordinary life. "I have spent 99 years learning that truth is more powerful than any conspiracy, but only if ordinary people are willing to pursue it with patience and courage. The men who killed my crew believed that power and influence could bury any crime. They were wrong, but it took nearly a century to prove it." Sarah Morrison had won the Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on Operation Anvil Drop, but more importantly, she had established a new model for international journalism that emphasized collaboration between reporters, historians, and citizen researchers. Her work had inspired similar investigations in dozens of countries, revealing patterns of wartime crimes that had been hidden for decades. Professor Hartwell had published a comprehensive academic study of Operation Anvil Drop that had become the definitive historical account of the conspiracy. His methodology for investigating classified crimes had been adopted by universities worldwide, creating new standards for historical research that involved sensitive or suppressed materials. Klaus Weber had lived to see his testimony contribute to a broader understanding of how ordinary soldiers on all sides had been corrupted by the opportunities that war created for personal enrichment. His cooperation with the investigation had helped establish precedents for truth and reconciliation processes that acknowledged crimes committed by multiple parties in complex conflicts. Margaret's role as curator of the new World War II Truth and Reconciliation exhibit had evolved into a broader mission of training citizen historians to investigate local mysteries that might reveal larger patterns of institutional cover-ups. Her methodical approach to metal detecting and archaeological documentation had become a model for amateur researchers worldwide. The ripple effects of the investigation continued to expand. Swiss banks had returned millions of dollars worth of assets to families of Holocaust victims, while American institutions had established funds to compensate communities that had been affected by the theft of cultural treasures. Universities had created new research programs dedicated to investigating historical crimes that remained classified or suppressed. Perhaps most significantly, governments had been forced to acknowledge that classification systems could not be used indefinitely to protect criminal activity, regardless of how much time had passed or how powerful the perpetrators had been. New laws required regular review of classified materials to ensure that legitimate national security needs weren't being used to cover up historical crimes. Margaret often reflected on the randomness that had brought her to Pierre Dubois's farm and led her metal detector to the exact spot where Harold Morrison had buried evidence of his crew's fate. The chain of events that followed seemed almost miraculous. The right people, the right skills, and the right timing converging to expose a conspiracy that had successfully hidden itself for nearly 8 decades. The permanent research center established at Pierre's farm had become a destination for historians, students, and families seeking to understand how ordinary citizens could challenge powerful institutions through careful investigation and persistent pursuit of truth. Pierre himself had become an unexpected advocate for historical transparency, using his family's experience to encourage other rural communities to investigate local mysteries from wartime periods. The investigation had fundamentally changed how Margaret understood the relationship between official history and hidden truth. Her teaching career had prepared her to recognize that historical narratives were often incomplete or deliberately misleading, but Operation Anvil Drop had shown her how systematic and enduring such deceptions could be. The final artifact in Margaret's collection was Harold Morrison's compass, which he had given to her during their last meeting. The modified compass, with its mysterious additional markings, served as a reminder that truth often required navigation through unmarked territory, guided by moral conviction rather than official maps. As Margaret prepared for her next investigation, reports of suspicious wartime activities in the Scottish Highlands, she carried with her the knowledge that patient, methodical research could overcome even the most sophisticated efforts to suppress historical truth. Harold Morrison's example had proven that justice might be delayed for decades, but it could not be permanently denied if people were willing to dedicate their lives to uncovering it. The story of Operation Anvil Drop had ended, but the larger story of holding powerful institutions accountable for their historical crimes was just beginning. Margaret Walsh, retired history teacher and amateur metal detectorist, had become an unlikely symbol of how ordinary citizens could challenge extraordinary conspiracies through persistence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to truth.